Hey, everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. Today, my guest is Gabriel Urbina, who is an audio fiction creator, a writer, a director, a man of all hats, and a good friend of mine.
Yay.
Everyone, please say hi to Gabriel.
Hello, hello. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. We have explored fandom in a very different way than we're about to explore it today
Yes.
together.
But also in a very related way, somewhat.
Yeah, in a very similar way, I would say. I would say that you got to take on one of the big questions that we're going to take on here, and
Hmm.
one might say even channeled some of the feelings that we're going to talk about and put them into fiction.
Absolutely.
For those of you who don't know, we worked on a show together called That Vampire Show. It is an audio fiction show about Kat Wright, who is a teenager and avid fan fiction writer who wins a contest to meet the creator of her favorite show, and things take a turn.
I
That's what we'll
personally
say.
think of Warren, that creator, as the protagonist of the show. Is that not how we all think about it? I I thought
he's
that he was the sympathetic
he's
figure, and
I
Kat
you
was
know the
the
thing is,
antagonist.
not to get too into it, but I do find them both sympathetic, which maybe is just by nature of having been on the writer's side of that show. But
They
I
are both. They
do
are both.
ultimately.
Like all glib jokes aside, they are
Yeah.
both sympathetic. I think that it
Yes.
is just that he is in such a position of power, whereas she is in such a position of only having a very, very specific kind of power that
Absolutely.
it inevitably feels a little bit harder to sympathize with him. And I would go as far as saying that he deserves less of our sympathy as he struggles with his flaws, relatable though they may be.
Agree. I will agree with you. I will say, yes, fine. I don't know, I think I just have a soft spot in my heart for Warren,
I do
but
as well. I do as well.
yeah, I love him. Love him. Love that guy.
But
All
anyway,
right.
let's stop talking about
Yeah.
that show about a man who created a show about vampire hunters to talk about something completely different.
Yes, what is the completely unrelated topic we'll be talking about today, Gabrielle?
We're going to be talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And kind of, the general, I think, umbrella of all things Joss Whedon, complicated man of not mystery, just badness. Um, but rather specifically, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is kind of like the one that was, I think, the first thing of his that I saw, and the thing that I think has done like the most, had the biggest fandom impact of
Mhm.
his in my particular life, and arguably the intellectual property that has knocked down the most dominoes in my life in
Mm,
particular.
interesting. Well, I'm excited to dive into all of it.
Let's
I
do
would say
it.
also arguably probably the most iconic of his work, even if that's not where you started.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
right?
I would say that, like, maybe nowadays people probably more people have seen the Avengers than have seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
True.
but
Yeah.
I think that when people think Joss Whedon, people still think Buffy the Vampire
Buffy the
Slayer.
Vampire Slayer. I agree
Totally.
with that. Do you remember the first time you ever saw Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Absolutely, I do. Um, and it's funny because it kind of happened in that sort of twilight liminal zone where, um, I was kind of in that place. It was pre-puberty, but it was kind of in that space where it was like, I'm 11. Maybe my media consumption should now stop being only the Cartoon Network. Maybe I need to start diversifying. And of course, my version of diversifying was I'm gonna start watching The Simpsons, which back home in Costa Rica aired on the Fox channel, which is apparently different than the Fox channel that exists here in the United States, but also it is possibly just like a different tentacle of the same corporate machine. Um, Unclear. And for whatever reason, Fox was the show in Latin America that showed Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and The Simpsons aired. I believe it was 7:30 to 8, Monday through Friday, and then depending on which day of the week it was, there would be a different show after it. Um, and as sometimes would happen, I would watch The Simpsons, and then the TV would stay on, and the next show would begin. And so that's how I think that as an 11-year-old, I ended up watching maybe like the first 10 minutes of an episode of Ally McBeal, and that was enough for me to kind of be like, okay, not for me, not right
Didn't
now.
get you?
Yeah,
Alright.
and I think that that's how I saw like the first like 10 episodes, or the first 10 minutes rather of an episode of say like Dark Angel, and that was also like, that's maybe a little too dark and too weird for me right now, not right now. Um, but I did see the first 10 minutes of an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I wanted to watch the next 10 minutes, and then I wanted to watch the next 10 minutes, and then I ended up seeing uh, the whole of an episode, and then the next week I was back. And it was unusual that a show would captivate me in that way because it was very much jumping into the middle of the action. At the time, Buffy was in its sixth season,
Oh,
a
wow, okay.
controversial, divisive, and dark season
The
for the
season,
show.
right?
And the show where there's already quite a lot of baggage to kind of like just jump in and kind of be like, oh, okay, well, that's where people are. Who that? Oh, apparently the sister was not always here. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And that blonde guy is good-ish. No, he's bad. No, he's good. What is happening? Um, but I found it engrossing and I found it fascinating, and it was kind of like the first real, I guess, like, yeah, like the first kind of like show aimed not at children that I really watched, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And once the season was over, I kind of found the way to like go back to the beginning and start watching it from the beginning until I had seen all of it.
So you watched all of season 6 or, like, at least part of season 6 while it was airing and
Yes.
then doubled back?
Yeah, I think that it was like maybe like I know that the musical had just happened because it was like maybe like I came in like around episode like 11 or 12 of the sixth season, saw through the end of that, and then they started airing the start of the sixth season, and I saw it again. And I remember the musical episode, which is I think like the eighth episode of that sixth season. That was one of the last things that I saw before it was like, oh, I'm back here now. Oh, I remember the first episode that I ever saw was the episode where she gets turned invisible. Um,
Oh, good
and that was a
episode.
good episode. Gone, yeah. Um, and the fact
Wild
that
episode to be watching at 11.
yes, yes, and there was undeniably an edge of like, ooh, I don't know if my mom would be happy that I'm watching this, and that I think made it all the more enticing and exciting. Um, and so yeah, so I kind of like went like middle of season six to end of season six, beginning of season six, caught up until I got to the invisible episode again. And then I found out that kind of like another channel was doing like season one of Buffy. And so I like watched that from the beginning, and kind of eventually caught up. And by the time I think that season seven happened, I was watching it now with kind of like the knowledge of everything behind me.
Okay, so that's the thing that I think is so interesting about talking to people about fandoms that happened before right now is
Hmm.
that when you find something not at the beginning, finding going back to find the beginning is an effort.
Yeah,
It's a huge aspect of you have to love something enough to find another network airing this show or to utilize web services that perhaps you shouldn't have been
right,
utilizing.
right.
But there
Going
was no
we didn't call it the dark web at the time, but going into the dark corners of the internet. No, and I think that there
Getting
absolutely was a certain amount of I'm going to read the summaries of what happened
mm,
before because as an
yeah.
11-year-old, what magic powers did I have to summon those episodes that had aired before? As far as I knew, those did not exist anymore. I only had the tablets on the internet to tell me the story of how she had fought the principal of her high school, and the mayor of the town and all these things that had happened before the show was where it was right now.
Mhm. So you almost, like, experienced, like, a lore element of trying to catch up and
Yeah.
reading. Yeah, that's actually really cool. It's a really cool way to get to dive into something. And also interesting that at 11, the season that ultimately I think became the most
Yeah.
divisive is the season that sucked you in.
Absolutely. And it absolutely was one of these things where like I was like, I think I love this show. And then I got to like season two and I was like, never mind. I love this show.
This
Like, this is the one. Um, and I definitely kind of like discovered a lot of the pleasures of the early season.
Mhm.
But I think that season six I've always had a very soft spot for because it was kind of the one that I really got sucked into. And it was a little bit the one that kind of like was my entry into that world and into like all of the things that make Buffy special, all of the like little like the wordplay, the kind of like the story structures, the kind of formalist edge of the show. All of these things that I did not have all the words to describe at the time, but that I was really like, there's something about this that I love. Like I love the way the characters speak. I love that kind of the genre almost changes every week. I love that they are doing all of this like crazy inventive stuff. I love that it is thorny and complicated and it's really making me feel things in spite of the fact that there are these like guys in rubber suits pretending to be demons.
And
I
it's
think
also that was the first season I think that they or not necessarily the first season, but the season where they took the most risks in what they wanted to explore. Like,
yes.
exploring really dark elements uh, which ultimately, certain risks that they took were not perhaps the best ones, but, it
Yes.
was a season where where they were really changing the game of what
Yes.
they wanted to explore, and so I think it's interesting that that's what sucked you in.
No, and like I remember that was the season that had the episode where all of a sudden she wakes up and she is a patient in a hospital. And there's kind of all of a sudden this edge of, wait a minute, has the entire show up to this point been um her having, this like mental breakdown in a hospital. And that was sort of like watching that as an 11-year-old, that was not only incredibly creepy, but it was sort of this like, wow, this is bold and wild that a show is in any way even gesticulating towards the store.
Right.
But it was also for me that was the first time that I ever saw Buffy's mom. Because until that
Oh,
point,
yeah.
Joyce was dead. Joyce was this thing from the past. And so kind of like seeing her for me, it wasn't, oh my god, Joyce is back. It was, oh my god, like this is the first time that we are seeing this mythical lost character from the past. The way that the scriptures foretold. There's Buffy's mom.
There's Buffy's mom.
Yeah.
Oh, so okay, so you were 11.
Mhm.
What else was going on in your life? You were, obviously at a point where you were trying to upgrade your taste from Cartoon Network to The Simpsons,
Yes, yes,
ready to be an adult.
with mixed results, with mixed results. And kind of feeling like I was like very like lagging culturally behind a lot of my peers. I think the way that a lot of people do at that age, like all of a sudden you look around one day and everyone is suddenly into music and you're kind of like, "Oh god, like what? Like what, I'm supposed to have opinions about these people? Who are these chili peppers? Why are they so red hot? What is happening?" Um and I was still very much kind of in this phase of like, like, guys, wait a minute. No, like 6 months ago, we were talking about Lord of the Rings because that movie had just come out and had just kind of like made like a cultural crater with its impact. Um, and I was kind of like in the place of like, can we like hang out and talk over there? No, you guys are just whizzing past me. Oh God, okay, sure.
Yeah. So feeling like, almost like a feeling of catch up of like, there's this other cool thing we could be doing, but now everyone's getting quote unquote cooler.
Everyone's getting quote unquote cooler. Everyone's quote unquote getting more mainstream. Everyone is, and like not just kind of like getting left behind, but also kind of like everyone is going into this like highway of culture that I'm just like not responding to. It's not like I'm listening to the music and finding what you guys are finding interesting about it. It would kind of take another kind of years, a couple of years for me to finally find music that I was really responding to. And it wasn't the music that my peers were listening to, it was like classic rock from like the 70s. That's where all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is what you guys have been talking about, but also
Mm.
not at all what you guys have been talking about.
It's totally
Interesting.
different. Right.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that you've always been cooler than everyone else.
Yes, yes, my hipster cred was fucking impeccable, even as an 11-year-old. No, that's an incredibly kind way of putting it. I think that much more of it was that I was quickly blossoming into the kind of high school outcast that the show was
Mm.
first centered on, and that I think
Mhm.
Buffy was very much pitched at, as a show. Yeah.
And it's interesting because you still felt that, um, connection even though that the point that you had watched that show had already passed. They were
Yes.
much more adults and they were out of the high school world, but you could still feel that influence to some degree of connecting to it, which I think is interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. But like even past the high school era, they are always still a little bit social outcasts. They are always sort of like Buffy obviously has kind of a lot of like chosen one ness to her, which kind of sets her apart from everyone. But Willow, Xander, even Dawn, they are all kind of like marked by all these like idiosyncrasies. They're all parts of these kind of like subgroups that are not consider the normal. They all live these like secret lives. And I was just like, yes, my people, here they are. They are not at all like me and live very far away, but somehow I connect to them.
Did anyone else that you knew watch Buffy at all, or was
No,
this like a solo adventure?
this was very much a solo adventure. I'm trying to think about when was the first time that I, like, ran into someone that, like, really knew the show, and I think that I was 17. I think it took, like, a
Wow.
very long time for me to meet someone in real life, and by then the show had gone, it had been over for a while. It kinda took a little bit of time to find someone IRL that knew that, so I had to kind of get that connection by, going to a lot of websites that were hosted on angelfire.net and such similar places.
Well,
Um,
that's what I wanted to get into. I was gonna say if you the Buffy fandom at the time, and still I assume, was very online. So nobody IRL, but you were on these message boards and sort of
yes.
pre-Tumblr
Oh,
space,
yes.
right?
Absolutely. And there's a little bit of like, what the heck was I doing during all that time? Because I know that they like sizable chunk of my pre-adolescence was spent on these places. And and like having arguments. But again, because I kind of was coming at it from this weird place where I had kind of started the story at the end and then gone back and caught up, I wasn't really able to participate in a lot of discussions that were like, which one of Buffy's boyfriends was the best one? Obviously Parker. We all know that. That is a
Oh,
gigantic joke that
I
I
hope
hope
that
made.
for everyone that can't hear Tone or see his face. That was, a joke, and you also watched my face fall as I
Yes,
was
yes,
not
as
certain.
you reacted. That is a humorous jape that is funny because he is the worst one of Buffy's man friends. Um, but yeah, but just kind of like a lot of time spent on there, a lot of time reading fan fiction, a lot of time um kind of getting to just like surround myself in that world and surround myself kind of in like the cultural apparatus of it.
Interesting. So a lot of reading fan fiction. Did you write any fan fiction? Hate to put you on the spot.
Eh, hilariously not for a Buffy. Um
Okay.
because I don't know, like I kind of have this like weird like if a story is in progress, I have a hard time kind of seeing how I can kind of interface with it as a creator. And if a story comes to an ending and it's an ending that I find satisfying, I'm a little bit like, boom, there it
Yeah.
is. The book is finished. I don't know what else to add to it. And to be clear, this is not throwing shade at anyone that practices their fanfic habits differently than I do. It is just an explanation of why my particular habits left me a little bit unable to interface with Buffy itself as a creator.
Absolutely.
The spin-off series Angel, on the other
Oh
hand,
boy.
has an ending that is kind of defiantly non-conclusive. It is kind of an ending that I absolutely love, and it was one of these things that, like, watching that, I think by the time that Angel ended, I was about 13, maybe going on 14. Um, and that is an ending that is like they're in the middle of everything. It's like, the way people talk about The Sopranos. Like, you want a show that just kind of like cuts to black in the middle of everything. Angel fucking like cuts to black at the start of this like pitched battle. And it's just kind of ends on this note of like, now we have like comics that are like, here is Joss Whedon's official version of what happened afterwards. But watching it in 2014, the message was like, what happened? And the message was kind of like, well, maybe they died, maybe they fought, maybe they went on other adventures. What do you think? And I did have thoughts, and I did write some fanfic about that, and I did put it online. And I have no idea if it's still out there or not. I definitely wrote it under some like I have no idea what my handle was back then, but it was definitely something horrible and embarrassing and very generic that would be very hard to find.
Hard to find. Nobody
Um,
look.
but that is the only fanfic that I've ever written. It was kind of a like continuation of Angel after that sort of like final episode. Aside from the Farscape fanfic that I wrote called Wolf 359, it must be said, but like the only thing that is labeled as fanfic that I ever wrote.
Oh, man. What I think is crazy about that, though, is that I think a lot of people write fan fiction, from a standpoint of I'm upset with how this thing happened and I wanna
Yes.
fix it, or I
I see the
wanna
potential, but it kinda twisted in a different way than I wanted it
than I
to.
wanted it to,
So I
right,
kinda
let
have to,
me
like,
here's my
like, dig up
twist.
this thing, yeah.
Yeah, versus what it sounds like for you is that the first thing that really made you want to write it down was, "I loved this so much, and it has inspired me to explore where it goes next,"
And there
which is
was a
pretty cool.
lot of things, and again, and this was kind of the first time that I felt plugged into the, like, behind the scenes part of being a fandom, because it wasn't just the show was ending, it was now all of a sudden we had all these news that were like, the show is unexpectedly canceled. There was a lot of controversy because it had been doing a lot better than it had the previous year. There was some sort of, disagreement between the producers about sort of like when they could get an order. And so then the network just kind of completely axed them. And you were kind of hearing about all this drama from the fan boards and from like all these websites. And then, so there is this sense of the creators aren't ending the story where they wanted it to end. It is getting canceled.
Right.
And on top of that, their kind of final note is this defiant, we're not ending the story goes on note. And so it was kind of this like, okay, the charge has been passed on. Somebody give me a pen. I guess we need to do this.
We must finish it.
Yeah, we
That's so
must
interesting.
continue to carry on the torch.
I think that's really cool because I think it's an element that, is very not that it doesn't still exist now, but that it's a very different element of
Hmm.
how we interact with sort of the trades, so to speak,
Yeah.
of what's going on behind the show. Because now with things like with Netflix and streaming and everything like that, your cancellations just sort of happen. It's
Yeah.
not this big like war. Whereas Buffy and Angel and stuff at that time it was network television that you were
Yes.
finding out it like there were those calls of everybody has to watch this show because it's gonna get canceled and I personally have to get 30 people to watch this
Right,
show.
and like, like, I don't care if you're not at home, leave your TV on to the WB so that,
Right.
like, the ratings will whatever,
Yeah,
yeah.
just leave it on and let it run and get your turn every TV in your household on to this network because
Yes.
each
Yes.
person matters. And I think that's the really big difference is there was this like feeling of individual viewing matter. Like as
Yeah.
long as you turn on, if you can get 6 friends to turn the TV on, we could save this show.
Right,
Um,
right.
which is now it's more so if we can get thousands of people to make this hashtag trend or this kind of thing or
Right.
that.
And I'm not even sure if back then that even was the case because I know that, like,
Right.
Nielsen's were its own separate thing that I didn't understand until years later, but it absolutely felt that way. It sort of felt that it was kind of this, like, you have a mission to proselytize this, like, you can make a difference, like, welcome to the pyramid scheme of, "Let's save Angel, let's keep Buffy on the air." If you get 6 of your friends to watch the show, and they get 6 of your friends to watch the show, yeah.
You personally will get a whole extra season.
Right. I
Um,
was a bad proselytizer. I never got a single one of my friends in Costa Rica to watch either show. They just like
really,
they never even wanted to give it a chance.
I will admit something to you. I did not watch Buffy despite all of my friends watching Buffy
Mhm.
until quarantine. All of my friends were
Wow.
obsessed with Buffy in high school and middle school because at
Mhm.
that point it was already off. It was everybody
Yeah,
had
yeah,
like the
yeah.
DVDs and that kind of thing. And they were like, "Oh, it's so cool! You know, it's not even it's this old show, blah blah blah."
Yeah.
And I just was so I don't know. Nobody sold me in a way that made me want to watch it.
The title is always a double-edged sword
Mm.
because for some people they kind of hear Buffy the Vampire Slayer and they're like, this is going to be subversive and postmodern and kind of playful in a way that I think absolutely that is woven into the core of the show. And it is a much better title for it than Slayer, which is what the WB wanted to call it. Um,
Oh,
but Slayer, I think, would do a much better job of getting the people that did not immediately tune into that wavelength. I think that, the people that did not immediately respond to it would be much easier to pull in if the
with
title had been
Slayer.
Slayer than Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is almost impossible to say with a straight face when the
Amazing.
audience is not going to be receptive. Like when when you're kind of doing the pitch and I lived this. I like spent so much time in high school trying to convince people to watch this show, and I would sort of be like, it's this great show. It's like inventive and it's got wonderful dialogue and it has like all of these like twists and turns and like it's shocking and like you have to see the second season like finale. It's going to make you cry more than anything. And they're like, all right, I'm cool. What is it? And I'm like, it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They're like, okay, I'm not watching that. And it's like, oh gosh darn it. Yeah.
It's so yeah, so it's so funny for me, the reason I think was that which if you listen to this podcast, I'm sure I'll continue to get into this, but I was a really big fan of Twilight in high
Hmm.
school and in middle school.
Ah.
When I was a middle
The
school
the other
girl.
divisive vampire property
The
of
other
the
day, yeah,
early
exactly.
2000s.
Yes, that one.
The other
Um,
one.
but the thing about it was, and I still find myself having this problem too in general fandoms or general things or marketing, was that the Buffy people were so, like, vocal about how stupid they thought Twilight
Oh, we were
was.
assholes. You can say it.
Yeah,
We were
and it
dicks.
it was just one of those things where I was like, it's so confusing to me because I'm so happy to enjoy another vampire show. I
Yeah.
one hu like, I was like, "I am your target audience. I am someone who already is, like, hokey, silly,
Right.
stupid, 100%,
And you have a
I am
very
here
kind
for
of
it."
that like literate, postmodern, playful kind of approach to
Absolutely.
media that is where the show lives.
Yeah, and so it was just so interesting because people were like, "Yeah, you don't even know vampires until you" I was like, "Okay, well, I do, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, I can tell you every single thing about this stupid book,
Mhm.
and I do know vampires, so if you wanna tell me about
Yeah.
this other vampire show and be nice about it, 100%." But it was like
Yeah.
this negativity of like, "We're so much cooler than you."
No, and
Um
I am not without sin in this. My like I think my last girlfriend before I went to college was someone who really liked the Twilight books, and I think that I was not as awful as I could have been, but I look back on my attitude towards that and cringe badly. And I think absolutely there is a certain amount of I read the first one and did not love it, but thought it was fairly inoffensive. Um, but there was a little bit of kind of an attitude, I think, amongst a lot of Buffy fans of why is this taking off in a way that our thing never did? Like our thing was always this like weird cult thing. This is getting a gigantic movie, and this is getting like all these things, and like everyone is talking about Team Edward and Team Jacob. Like nobody talked about Team Angel and Team Spike this way. What is happening? Um, and nerds are historically very bad at sort of that, like realizing that another property having its day in the sun does not mean that their own property is getting eclipsed.
Yeah.
And I think that especially kind of, um, you know, teenage boys, which I'm sorry to say I was once one of. I was an unfortunate member of that club. Are also historically very bad at kind of that, at kind of like recognizing we can trade and like you can watch my vampire thing and I can read your vampire thing and we can all be happy and we can compare notes and it would have been wonderful. What a wonderful world that we could have had. Instead, we were like, let's burn it down. Let's just make everyone miserable. Um, so no, I completely get that the Buffy versus Twilight wars were real.
We're so
And
real,
no, they
yeah.
were very real, unfortunately. Um, and how I wish that we could say that that was the last controversial thing that ever happened around Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but we're
I don't
gonna
know what you're
get there.
talking about. I've only ever heard of
No,
this that's
no.
the only one I experienced. Um
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think but I think the thing that is interesting about that response, though, is that the element of what attracted you to the show and what I think attracted a lot of people to the show is that element of being an outsider,
Yeah.
and then something else becoming more mainstream of the same like, "Why is this thing working and our
Yes.
thing is so outside?" It's like it's a heightened feeling of the, "Well, this is why I like the show, this is why I relate to it, and now you guys are making our show the outsider show again, and we
How dare
didn't
you?
like, we were here
Yeah,
first." Yeah.
absolutely.
I think there's something really crazy about that, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
Tracks. Um,
Yes.
I do love the fact that you were in a Twilight Buffy, war of a
Yes,
relationship and
yes. Um, I am elated to say that we did not break up over that. Although if my girlfriend at the time had dumped me over my bad attitude about that, I would have, like now retroactively, I would be like, yeah, girl, high five. Like, you deserve better.
You deserve Edward Cullen.
You deserve whichever one you want to have.
You can have whoever you want.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay, so I think what's cool is that you then eventually do, become a little obsessed with the creator behind
Oh,
the
yeah.
show. Um,
A
so
little. Lol.
so but what I do think is interesting is that that's not necessarily always the case. I don't think the average television viewer can tell you who
No.
created the show, what this person is about,
Right.
and why it matters. So how did you find yourself getting connected from just watching the show to caring about who made it?
That's a great question, and this is something that, because of things that have happened in recent years, I've been a little bit trying to unpack in my own mind about what was it about the Joss Whedon properties that made me a fan not just of Buffy and Angel and Firefly and eventually Dollhouse later on down the line, but that then kind of made me like a fan of like Joss Whedon the filmmaker and the television auteur. Um because you're right. Like, like not a lot of people watched Lost and then kind of went like, I'm a Damon Lindelof fan. I want to study that man. Even though Damon Lindelof, incredibly talented
Study that
showrunner
man.
and
Yeah.
deserves to be studied in depth. Um, but no, but like I think that there absolutely is something to and like, this is where kind of like you get into a lot of how can you separate the art from the artist when it comes to Buffy? Because it is true, there was a murderer's row of talented writers and directors and technicians that worked on that show. If you look at the people that wrote on that show, everyone from Jane Espenson to Drew Goddard, David Fury, Doug Petrie, they are like the makers and shakers of like genre television for like the next 20 years. It's like
Right.
wild. And yet, every time that an episode was written and directed by Joss Whedon, it was like, dad's home. Like
Mm.
everything was sharper, everything hit harder, everything just was like framed a little bit better. The writing was just like a little bit crisper. Um, and there is something to Buffy the Vampire Slayer that I think like, and this is I think part of the reason why so many film students really came out of the Buffy fandom. It is a show where you can play the game of kind of covering up the credits and like who wrote this, and usually you'll be right because it is a show where every writer is allowed to have its own voice. And when the Joss Whedon episodes came on, they were usually sort of just this like it was like Buffy on speed, like just like everything was like supercharged, and they were the most Buffy episodes.
Right.
And then after a certain point, it started to be oh, and they're also the crazy experimental episodes. Like the Joss Whedon episodes were the one where it was like, okay, and now everybody shuts up and we do 40 minutes without dialogue for the entire show. That was the one where it was like, okay, and now we do an entire episode that is just like the horrible after crash of somebody dying and kind of every character having to like in a very raw way dealing with that. Now we're gonna do the musical episode over on Angel. He was the one that was like when they did a ballet episode, he was the one that directed that one. When they did
Yeah.
one that was like everyone reverts back to their previous teenage state, he kind of did that one. So it was kind of very clear that as a show, it is almost daring you to not notice the Whedon episodes and to kind of ask yourself, like, okay, what is it about this guy that is making these episodes kind of stand out?
Mhm.
And that's how you end up doing things like listening to directors' commentaries for the DVD box sets. And I think that unfortunately, and this I think is one of the things that like really lulled so many people under Joss Whedon's spell. The man has a real talent for not only making compelling television, but explaining the thought process behind compelling television.
Mhm.
Um, I would still, well, maybe not still, but up until very recently, I would recommend anyone that is interested in kind of serial narrative writing and kind of visual storytelling to go back and listen to those commentaries because they speak very coherently and fluidly about why cameras are placed the way that they are, why certain cuts happen the way they are, why certain kind of plot movements happen the way that they do, why certain words were chosen. it is very kind of minutia-driven commentary while still being very understandable.
Right.
And also, of course, filled with charming anecdotes about things that happened on the set and funny observations and offhanded jokes. Um, and if you're kind of someone who, at age 14, 15, is kind of suddenly realizing, like, oh my God, somebody wrote and directed Buffy the Vampire Slayer, that is the best job that anyone in the world could ever have. I want that job.
Yeah.
How do I make myself into someone that wants that job? Okay, step one, let's like learn about film, and you get like the official like how to film textbook. And god damn it, most of those are either technical to a level of being impenetrable or philosophical to the level of you open it and chapter one is like to hold a camera is to hold a man's soul vis-a-vis their reflection upon the shadow world in which we all inhabit. Also socialism. And you're like, okay, I have no idea how to interact with that. Um, and here was a man that was kind of going like, come with me. First, I'll entertain you, and then I will gloss my my process in a way that that makes it believable that you will one day be able to do this in this way. And boy, that's when he had me. Like, boy, that's when it went from like, I love this TV show to kind of like, I love this man and I will follow him to the ends of the earth.
Yeah.
And boy, did I do that.
You found the end of the earth, which we'll get to.
We'll get there.
But
We'll get there. Yeah.
yeah, I think what's so interesting is that so my experience with Joss Whedon was Dollhouse, which is a
The
weird entry point.
troubled child. Yeah.
Yeah, but a weird entry point because I loved it.
Mhm.
Devastated by the cancellation,
Yes.
devastated by the ending of be feeling so rushed and just not feeling correct. Loved
Look, it was a Whedon show that had an ending. Us Angel
That's
fans
fair.
that were still hurting, like, we're like, all right. Like, okay, that was
Like,
rushed,
fine,
but it had a
alright.
conclusion, okay?
Right. So I
Yeah,
watched
but no, I feel you.
Dollhouse. Yeah, and then I doubled back and I watched Firefly, and I was like,
Mhm.
"This is amazing."
Yes.
But everything so Dollhouse I watched while it was on the air,
Yeah.
and so I dealt with the cancellation. Then Firefly was already over by the time I got to it, and I was like, "This sucks. This was amazing, and I can't believe someone would not understand that this is a piece of genius work and that we
Yes.
should all have had more." And then I was at that point heavily obsessed with the MCU.
Mhm.
And Joss Whedon was
And he
announced
and he
as
had
the
just been given
director
the
of
keys to the
yeah,
MCU, yeah.
he had just been handed the keys to the biggest thing in my life at the
Yeah.
time. Like
Yeah.
this was like I had been preaching the good word of the MCU to an insane degree at that point.
Yeah.
Iron Man came out when I was 12, 2008. So
Dang.
yeah. That was my
Yeah.
bread and butter. And
No,
then
like I imagine in so many ways, like that was to, talk about in my life, Lord of the Rings at age 11. That kind
yes.
of was the meteor that hit and made a like cultural crater. I imagine that like seeing Iron Man at that age, that was kind of that would have been the thing that was like, whoa, stop everything. What is this?
Yeah, it was insane, and it was also this thing where, I had been reading the comics since I was little. I was, like, huge into comic books, and none of my friends would read comic books,
Yeah.
and then they said Robert Downey Jr. is playing Iron Man, and I went and saw the movie, and I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life." And then all of my friends were like, "Well, if it's a movie, I'll watch it." And then everyone was like, "No, this is the coolest thing we've ever seen in my life." And so it was like this moment where I was like, "Yeah, I told you. I've been telling you that this is really cool."
Right,
And
right, right.
now now
I
you
want it
get
on
it.
record that I knew that this was cool before.
Before they put a hot guy in the movie.
Right, right.
And and so then it was this point where I was like, okay, so now everybody believes what I've been saying. Everyone buys my gospel.
Yeah.
And then my friends were really big Buffy fans at
Mhm.
that time. And so then when they announced that Joss was taking it over, I had watched all of Joss's other stuff, but then he came on for the Avengers. And I remember feeling like when they announced that they were doing the Avengers, I remember being like, I just don't know how they're gonna do it.
Yeah.
Like I don't think it's possible. I trust
It's
them.
too big. Like how
It's
can
too
this
big.
it's like the reverse Titanic. It's too big.
Right.
How can it
Yeah.
float?
Exactly, exactly. It's just absurd. And I was like, and at that point too, because you already have your feelings, I was like, "Ugh, like Steve Rogers is so boring. They're gonna
Yeah.
make me watch him in these movies." It was
Thor
just,
did not work at all, and
yeah.
I don't know about this Hemsworth character, like,
I don't
ooh.
know about this guy,
Yeah.
but he seems. I was
Spoilers, the Hemsworth guy won me over.
he works out,
Yeah.
literally and figuratively.
Yes.
And
My
Chris Evans
lord.
wins me over too.
Yeah, yeah,
Spoiler
yeah.
alert. But I do remember because those movies were that theory. They had started this thing where they were like, one person is in charge of each character.
Yes. Yeah, you kinda have, like, Favreau with Iron Man, and Brana had Thor, and so on, yeah.
Yeah, and so everybody has one thing, and then they were like, "We're bringing this new guy who's gonna make all of these things that are so completely different that only one of them is like the best movie you've ever seen in your life,
Mhm.
and everybody else is sort of figuring it out. And we're gonna have a new guy come, and he's gonna take over and make all of these things mash together." And I was like, "I just, I may be 17, but I think I know a lot more than you, and I
Yeah.
just don't think it's possible."
If you'd asked me, yeah. No, and if I remember correctly, some amount of, like, behind the scenes tension as well, because Favreau originally wanted to do
Wanted
the
it, yeah,
Avengers movie, and they
yeah.
kind of went like, "No, we want Joss Whedon, who has, made one movie that did not make all that much money, and then like his last TV job was like directing an episode of The Office. We want that guy to like come and direct
Yeah, it was like
this
it was
movie."
this crazy thing because I was like, so the only person who knows what they're doing, you're not gonna give it to him,
Mhm.
and you're gonna give it to this guy who arguably knows how to make really cool TV, but it doesn't seem to be able to keep anything on the air.
Yep.
Like that.
Ugh.
And that was where I was like, "Look, I really
You're
like
gonna get
Firefly.
Mr.
I really like
Canceled
it."
to
Yeah. I was like, "You're
do
gonna bring
this.
this idiot in?" Like,
Yep, 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 yep.
this makes sense, and, in the way that when you're 17, you think you know everything. I was like,
Oh
"Well, I
yeah.
guess I'll go s I mean, I'll see it. I'll see it."
Right.
But, and that movie came out my senior year, and I convinced my friends who we were all incredibly into it to the point that, like, some of my friends' names in my phone to this day from high school are still the various Avengers they
Nice,
identified with the
nice.
most. So that's how deep we were.
That's
And,
awesome.
yeah, it was a core part of our friendship. Um and then but also everybody had their favorites, right? Like, everybody
Right.
was like, I was like, "Iron Man is the greatest movie that's ever been made." And everyone was like, "I mean, I know why you feel that way, but this guy's kind of a dick." And I was like,
Uh-huh.
"Well, I don't know what to tell you,
Yeah.
but you and your little apple pie boy have nothing interesting
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
say."
Come on.
So, with all of that, I was just like, "Okay, so we're gonna go see this movie." And what we decided to do was we used our one sort of senior pass to get out of, like, we were like, "We're not coming to school."
Mhm.
We went and
Wow,
we
that's awesome.
drove. I know, very intense. It's called lying and calling in sick.
Ah,
But
nice, nice, nice. I
but
should have had that in high school, yeah.
it's called having a bad moral compass. But
Excellent,
um
excellent.
we drove an hour outside of LA to
Mhm.
go to a theater that was playing every single Avengers movie
Nice.
in order,
When that was
and then
still like a marathon, but like a human marathon, as opposed to
yeah.
now when it's like, okay, you need to take like a week off work to do
Right.
this.
Yeah, no, this was one day. Like, you got to the theater at, like, 10 in the morning, I wanna say,
And then by like
10 or 11.
9, it's like the Avengers or something.
Yeah, it was
Yeah. Is it
midnight, and
midnight? Oh, wow.
because they had programmed bathroom breaks as well,
Uh-huh.
because
Sure,
God
that's smart,
forbid
that's
you
smart.
stand up during the movie.
Sure, sure, sure.
So
Whoa, whoa.
but this was also before assigned seating.
Uh-huh.
So you had to rotate. If someone had to pee, someone had to stay with your seats,
Oh, snap,
because if you had
okay.
gotten there late,
Yeah,
someone was
someone
gonna
could
move
snipe
in.
you, yeah.
Exactly.
Oh,
So it
no.
was a huge situation, a huge, big thing, and I went into it and I was like, "I know I'm not gonna like it." And I
Mhm.
left that movie, and I literally remember saying, "Joss Whedon is a genius,"
Yeah.
like, on the way home. I was like,
Mhm.
it was 3 in the morning, and I was like, "Joss Whedon is a genius." And it was this crazy thing where it was the first movie that all of us agreed on. Like, all of us were like, "Yeah, it was
Yeah,
perfectly done."
yep.
It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy, and I was like, "Okay, Mr. Cancel does know what he's talking about." Um
This was before he was really Mr. Canceled.
Mr. Canceled.
Yeah.
Yes, just Mr. Network TV Canceled knows
Ooh.
how to direct a film. But it was the same thing. It was that we left that movie. I saw The Avengers in theaters 8 times.
Mhm.
Um, I was so obsessed with it, and I was so like, we went to, because I grew up in LA, so we went to the El Capitan where they have, like, like, they always do like a what's it called? Like a, museum type, like,
Sure. Like
display.
an exhibit.
Yeah, and it's also where they don't do them in there anymore, but it's where they did the Disney premieres,
Uh-huh,
so
yeah,
you could
totally.
go and sit, and so I remember for my birthday, my friend bought me tickets to go see it there for the 6th time that I had seen the movie,
Nice.
and and she picked our seats based off of where Joss would have watched the movie from.
Nice.
So,
Hell
God
yeah.
only knows if that's actually true, but in my teenage life and based off of what she read on the internet, she was like, "This is where he would have sat," and so we watched the
I
movie from
mean,
there.
if that was a lie, dope lie. Like, hell
Great
yeah.
lie.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
great lie.
I support that lie.
But it was one of those things where you dissected it, and it's the first time I can remember using language like, tracking shots
Mhm.
and learning
Yeah.
film language to be able to talk about about that
Mhm.
movie. And
Yes.
then sitting and watching and listening to every interview I could get my hands on
Mhm.
of how did you make these people who have nothing in common work? Like, how did you take these movies and make them into one movie that makes not only makes this movie so good, but makes all of the other movies better?
Elevates the other ones,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was just so incredible.
Mhm.
And that was really when I really would say, like, I was like, this guy is so different.
Yeah,
Um, and he has something that makes me want to understand, because before that, I was on Tumblr dissecting Iron Man and character
totally.
development and those kinds of things, but I was never talking about, a close shot or a wide shot or this type of lighting or fighting styles and the way should like Scarlett Johansson, who plays Black Widow in Avengers, is injured in that final scene, and you
Mhm.
see her limping, and you see the humanity of it, and I ate all of that up, um,
Yeah,
and then that's when I had the same experience you did, where you were like, "This guy is talking about it in a way that it doesn't even," because at that time, I still hadn't made the decision to go to film school, and at
totally.
that time, I was like, it was just in this way where you were like, "I understand this language, and I should be using it. I should talk about things in this way that is not inaccessible."
And, like, there are certain you watch, like, a Bella Tarr movie, and you have to confront the cinematic apparatus, but that's a little bit of, like, well, this is homework, like, this is, like, pure asparagus, like, I'm learning something, but it is kind of this terse, confrontational, formal experience. Whereas the wonderful thing about so many of the Whedon properties when they're really working is that that gear is there when you're ready to look for it. But if you just kind of want to stay up here, boy, it works as a roller coaster. Like you can just kind of like go and have fun and enjoy it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's, and so well, okay, so what I think is cool though is that I guess we both had the same experience, which is that this creator is the first one who gave us language to talk about what we ended up wanting to do.
yeah, and kind of that ability to interface with the formal side of this medium. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you find yourself at that point, once you had started to understand that vocabulary and that language, is that sort of when you found yourself going, "Okay, maybe film school is a thing I wanna do?"
Well, yes, I mean, I was already kind of considering film school, because it
Okay.
kind of was like, okay, well, I want to apparently now, because before Buffy and sort of like before really falling down the rabbit hole, I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I thought that I wanted to write books. And then kind of like Buffy was like, no, I think I want to write and direct the films. I want to do the kinema. Um, so I need to go to those film schools. But then one of the things was, well, I think that my favorite writer and creator is this Joss Whedon guy, and he seems to know a lot about it. Where did he go, and how did he get the way that he is? And Joss Whedon, like any good Wesleyan graduate, will take every opportunity to tell you that he went to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, and studied in the film department there under Janine Basinger. Um, and it wasn't immediately a like, okay, boom, done deal, I'm going there. But it was something where I was kind of like, okay, great, I need to consider going to Wesleyan. Um and this is where it is kind of the like, like how intensely did I follow this man? Because I did end up visiting Wesleyan when my mother and I were considering universities for me, and I sat in on a bunch of film classes during that college tour. And frankly, most of them were bullshit. Most of them were kind
Mm.
of, again, sort of in that level of like, well, I feel that you're kind of just like bringing in an outside lens and putting it over the movie, which is interesting and not without value, but it's not really telling me a lot about why the film works the way that it does. Or we're kind of so focused on like, okay, kids, this is how you use Final Cut Pro. And I was like the annoying nerd kind of being like, but you haven't explained what's a good cut. You haven't explained how editing works.
Mm.
And a lot of places had honestly an attitude of, well, nobody can explain that to you. Like you kind of can only explain the tools, and you kind of have to. You either know that or you don't. And then I went to a film class at Wesleyan, and it was like, anyway, let's talk about the tools and how they work. And I was like, thank you. I knew that I was not nuts. Like I knew
Right.
that someone out there was going to be able to like explain this stuff.
Yeah.
And I love the classes. I love the school in like a lot of different ways. I ended up going to school at Wesleyan. And then it was like, okay, well, Joss Whedon was a film major here, so and I want to do film, so I'm gonna be a film major here. And then Joss Whedon says that he mostly learned film from this one professor who was the head of the department. So I'm going to do absolutely everything that I can to take as many classes with her as I could. Um, by that point, that professor mostly only taught seniors. I managed to worm my way into her classes as a sophomore. Um,
Okay.
I was the first person to get the entire suite of all her classes in something like over a decade. Like it was like a very,
Wow.
very long time. Um, and this particular professor, Janine Basinger, I think that she is an absolute genius. She's the best professor that I've ever had. And listening to her, it was like listening to those like Joss Whedon commentaries, but like from the source. Like it was just kind
Right.
of a like, like so much, like so much not only brilliant teaching, but kind of very accessible, down to earth, applicable teaching. In a way that so much teaching about art just kind of isn't. Like is so much teaching about art is so jargon filled and so technical. And this was just kind of like, look, somebody made this movie. This movie was designed to make you understand certain things in a certain order and at a certain time, and make you feel emotions in a certain order and at certain times. Let's talk about how those decisions in the movie made that understanding and that emotion happen. And I was just like, this is literally all that I want to do for the entire rest of my life. Thank you. Like, this is perfect. And why is
Yeah.
all education not like this?
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I took all of those classes and was like really trying to like do my best to kind of be like, this is your brain on film studies and
Mhm.
particularly kind of Wesleyan film studies. Um, it also must be said, during this time, I was also taking classes with Sarah Shackett and with Zach Valenti. I was working with Noah Mazer. I was going to plays and seeing Scotty Shoemaker and Emma Sherjarko, like all of the people that would like really in many ways be the actual people that define my career. I was also meeting during this time. But at the time, I was like, really, really focused on my education. And then my junior year, end of my junior year, is when the Avengers comes out.
Okay.
And the Avengers blows up, and the Avengers is amazing. And everybody at Wesleyan goes to see the Avengers, and we all love it. Um, and all of a sudden, it's like I have a very good friend who liked Taylor Swift when Taylor Swift was like this like 13-year-old country singer.
Mhm.
And I talked to her about like, boy, your dark horse really came in. Like, like Jesus, like, you were plugged in.
Yeah.
Um, I a little bit felt like that senior year at Wesleyan, it was a little bit like my dark horse came in, like a little bit of
Mm.
kind of like the guy that I showed up here and I like really wanted to study him. And mind you, a lot of people at this university now had seen the shows and did like Joss Whedon. I finally was like, thank God I can talk about this with civilized people. Um, all of a sudden it was like, oh, and by the way, he just made the biggest movie in the world and $1 billion, and he's huge now. Um, and to just kind of like completely finish the like very warping head trip, 1 year later when I graduated from Wesleyan, he was my commencement speaker.
Oh, wow.
because he had just made the
Because he had
biggest
blown
movie in the
up,
world,
right.
and so, um, which is wonderful at the time, before we knew a
I feel
lot of the
like
things that we now know.
this whole episode, there's such a disclaimer of like, yes, we know what happened
Yes,
and
and we
we're
will
working
talk
on it.
about it, I'm sure, in a moment. Um, but at the time, it was very like, if as my friend Dottie put it when she heard the story, if you're looking at this from the perspective of me and you
Mhm.
kind of have 23-year-old main character energy, um, it's very easy to kind of feel like, okay, God, these are the signs, like, got it. I will go forth and be the second coming of Joss Whedon. And then like 3 years later, it started to come out that was like, hey, by the way, maybe this guy did a whole bunch of creepy stuff, and oh, he was very abusive. And it was like, okay, maybe I will not be Joss Whedon 2.0. But no, but for a while, it was kind of this like very he sort of set a template and I tried my darndest to kind of follow that template.
Mhm.
And that led me to, I think, the absolute best film education that I could have found as an undergraduate student, at least within the United States. And for my brain specifically, like, I don't want to kind of like, there's a lot of great film schools and different
Sure.
ones for different people. But for me specifically, boy, that was exactly the one that I needed and exactly the one that my brain was craving at the time.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of lessons in there that I continue to apply in my writing today, and as I kind of consider making new shows and new things. Um, so it's very kind of all like wrapped up in it.
Yeah, well, what I think is cool about it, though, is that, I think you have a very lucky element of it, of getting to
Yes.
learn from the person who taught the
Yes.
person who got you there, right? So it's like,
Absolutely.
I think it's cool that you like, when you said, like, going and sitting with that professor and hearing sort of, as you said, the stuff that connected you to Joss Whedon, but from the source.
Hmm.
Do you feel like having that experience helps with what ended up coming, which I guess we should probably dive
Yeah, we should.
into.
Why don't we
Yeah.
dive into it? Let's
So,
dive on in.
if you're listening and you've used the internet before,
Yes.
you've probably you've
Ooh.
probably heard that Joss Whedon is, not the best guy.
No, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's kind of like there's a little bit of like which scandal would you like to do first? Because there's kind of the like, he hid behind the shield of I'm Mr. Feminism and I produce the most feminism shows and I am
Yeah.
the most feminist guy. And then his wife wrote a scathing letter kind of saying, "Oh, he used that to protect himself while he had so many affairs behind my back."
Right?
Um then there was kind of, like a lot of people have come forward and gone. He was verbally abusive to me. He was dismissive of my work. He
Mhm.
made absolutely crazy demands. He, um, there's the whole Ray Fisher of it all, which
Yep.
is a long and complicated saga of him coming into a movie that he did not uh, initiate and did not own,
Mhm.
and just as far as we can tell, being kind of wall to wall awful to this young black actor who was
Mhm.
in his first major role.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. There's
What else
even
is
like
there?
there's even like it's like how far does the barrel go? There's like
Yeah.
so many actresses and some actors, but especially a lot of actresses that like have
Mhm.
worked on his shows have now kind of said he was in some way inappropriate to me. There is
Mhm.
absolutely chilling accounts of Michelle Trachtenberg, apparently the crew working to make sure that Joss Whedon was never alone in a room with Michelle Trachtenberg,
Yep.
who it has to be said was 15. She was
Yep.
15 at the time. So it's like the best case scenario is that he was talking to her in a way that was not appropriate for
Acceptable,
anyone to
right.
be talking to a 15-year-old. The worst case scenarios are things that I don't even want to dwell upon.
Yeah.
Um and yeah, and he's done a little bit to try to address these things. Oh, there's also, firing Charisma Carpenter because she was pregnant. Like
Pregnant, yep.
it's a
The list goes
cavalcade
on.
of
That's what's
terribleness.
unfortunate is there is no, I don't even feel like there's an end to the list, which
Yeah.
is a hard thing.
Yes.
Because you're looking at someone who has obviously, as we've talked about, heavily affected your life, but also heavily affected the desire to create, the
Mhm.
desire to be a creator that has set you on the path that got you to meeting the people that you ended up creating
Yes,
with.
absolutely.
Um, and it has to be said that Joss Whedon's not the first person who's made a movie and turned out to be a bad person.
No, 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 no. I think that was Alfred Hitchcock. I think he was
Yeah,
the
I don't
first
know.
one.
Yeah, he's probably the only guy, actually. There's 2 of them,
Yes.
2 bad
Yeah.
men.
Yes, it's Hitchcock, and then we had 50 or so years of, like,
Only good
awesomeness,
guys, yeah.
and now we have Joss Whedon, yes. Yeah.
Um, so
70s were particularly great for
yeah, I've
well-behaved
never heard
filmmakers.
anyone complain, so
No.
no, so I
Hashtag
think,
sarcasm.
yes, if you can't hear it in our voices, we are just crying a little bit about
No,
the types of things that
it
happen
is
in the
kind of
world.
wildly endemic, just like how many, like, apparently shitty people, kind of end up being, like filmmakers. Like,
Yeah,
I was like, "How do I qualify this?" And then it's just like, yeah, no, for whatever reason, it seems to be a job that really does attract a lot of people that then go on to treat a lot of other people horribly.
yeah. But I think what it leads us to is the question that sort of comes up when these things happen, which is, can you separate the creator from their work?
And to
And
that I
especially
say,
now.
Ah, because no, because here is it is especially tough with someone like Joss Whedon
Mhm.
because, you know, on the one hand, you do look at Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example, and my lord, again, there are so many there's so many brilliant, talented people that worked on that show. You don't want
Right.
to kind of, my lord, like I'm always in shock that Sarah Michelle Gellar has not won an Oscar by now because you look at
Stunning,
her
yeah.
in that work and like you look at her in that show and she is acting her ass off. She is
Mhm.
unbelievable. Same with almost every cast member. It is brilliant and talented and a truly kind of like I think like one of the best television performances ever by James Marsters across
Yeah.
Buffy and Angel. And you don't want to kind of take all of that and be like, well, we must now throw it in the trash. Goodbye
Right.
to all of that amazing work.
Right.
Likewise, countless technicians and countless other directors. Um, and it is a little bit of what we said before. Like, well, you can really feel when it's a David Fury episode versus a Jane Espenson episode versus a
Mhm.
Doug Petrie or a Drew Goddard or a Stephen DeKnight episode.
Yeah.
Um, isn't it worth, like clearly their voices are there. And where that gets complicated for me is like man, I was the person that from like 2005 to 2019, I was reading every interview about how the Mutant Enemy writers' rooms worked.
Mhm.
Um, and the number of times that those people kind of went like, yeah, I wrote kind of a like half-formed script, and then Joss Whedon came in and told me, move this over there and move this over there and move this over there. And by the way, put this line in. And those
Yeah.
were the things that made the episode work. And that one line is the only thing that people quote me from that script that I wrote. And they're always like, I love that line. And I always have to be like, that was the line that Joss
Joss
wrote.
wrote. Yeah.
Um, and it is kind of this like interesting balancing act where kind of like I look at it, and part of it is I cannot deny all of the other people that worked on this. And I can't deny that this is, for example, a Jane Espenson script. It just undeniably asserts itself as an Espenson script.
Mhm.
But then there's also kind of this, but he is so woven into the fabric of it. Like,
Yeah.
even kind of in these things where other people are working and doing amazing work that deserves to be recognized, he is very much still just like tied up in all of it and just this constant focusing agent and this constant defining agent throughout all of his shows. Um, which leaves me kind of in this place of I don't know, somebody pass me the whiskey bottle. I kind of don't know how to uncouple this from the other. I think that it's a lot easier in terms of kind of I'm very much someone that is like, you know, I don't care how shitty the original creator was. That never means that the art of the fans has to be thrown away. I think that that part of it is unambiguous for me, of just kind of like so much amazing art and so much amazing creations has come out of the Buffy fandom and out of the Whedon fandoms in general. And that I think is still 100%. I still derive a lot of meaning from it. I still derive a lot of enjoyment of it. The Passion of the Nerd, this amazing YouTube channel, is to this day doing video essays that are breaking down the Buffy and Angel episodes, episode by episode. I think it is one of the best YouTube channels right now, and I think that that part of it all I can still so easily engage with because it is something that is coming from. It's not about where the creator left it; it's about where this fan took it and ran with it. Um, but the shows itself are now thorny and difficult for me. I don't know.
They're hard, yeah.
Yeah,
I think what's hard for me, because this, as we said, is not the first person that's ever turned out to be a bad person that made something you liked.
yeah,
But I think what's difficult for me, I've always wondered, and I don't know what the truth is, and you'll never really know, is the amount of power that comes from being in the type of position of, "I made this thing up, it
hmm
shouldn't really work. People
and
are giving
somehow
me
does.
millions of dollars and
Yeah,
everyone's saying that it changed their lives."
yeah,
Is it that that turns you into a bad person, or were you a bad person already, or was there something leaking that has just now been unlocked? And it's one of those things where I do
right.
think like that position can change who you are
Yes.
and change how you're behaving. And so it's like, are we, by nature of doing something as absurd as creating a television show
hmm
that works, that
Yeah.
costs millions of dollars and is this huge risk, and then they put it on television and they hope that people watch it, and then people do watch it, and it gets to such an insane degree that people are saying things like, "I am going to go to the college that this man went to
Right.
after decades of
Oh yeah.
consuming his content." Like, when you start to have that as the input of who you are as a person and what your work matters, is that what turns you into a bad person? Or were
That's a
you already
great
there,
question.
you
That's a
know?
great question. And with someone like Joss Whedon, it is especially interesting because remember, Buffy didn't start off as the TV show. It started as this movie that
Right.
he wrote. And his line has always kind of been, I wrote a great script, and the director and a couple of the actors took it in the wrong directions and just kind of completely did it wrong. And then I got to do it right. And now that I'm doing it right, now that I'm in charge and people are following my brilliant ideas, oh, look at that. People are getting tattoos of the show and we're getting nominated for Emmys and we're this like
Right.
cult hit and there are, academic essays being written about it and like all these things. To a certain extent, you see the same thing with Firefly where it was, I had a show, it got canceled. When I got a chance, I got to make a movie out of it that, all right, did not make all the money in the world, but for what it was an extremely well received movie. And it was like one of the more, still one of the more celebrated like sci-fi space opera movies of the past 20 years.
Yeah.
Um, there is this, I don't know if I would call it persecution, sort of recurring thing to him. Because it's like, no, 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 no. This man has not been persecuted. This is a man
No,
that has
no.
lived in a cradle of privilege
Right.
for so much of his life. It also has to be said he is a third generation TV writer. Like both, like he comes from a like dynasty of like people that have worked in the entertainment industry. Um, but it
A few less hurdles to jump, I suppose you could say.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And but yeah, but it is kind of this interesting question of like, you know, if you end up in these positions where when you do something and people take power from you, it goes wrong.
Mhm.
And then when you get to do it again and people do give you power and they do it the way that you say, it goes right.
Yep.
I mean, how many steps are between that and I am Zeus
Right.
and I can just do whatever I want the way that Zeus does?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think, and I don't think either version of it makes it acceptable,
No.
obviously.
No,
But it is an
it's an interesting
interesting
anthropological, kind of like academic question.
question.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the answer is that you're still a bad person doing bad things.
Right, right, right.
But I do think it's an interesting question, which I think is where I get stuck with the work, because I've had this conversation a bunch of times with people, which is that I think there used to be an element of the movie star, and we're losing that because the more we
Mhm.
learn about people, the more you realize they're just a person,
Yeah.
um, and that people are not flawless. Like, they're not generally speaking, most people that you come into contact with, there's gonna be something that they've done that you find to be not great.
Yeah.
And so I think the more we become online and people become so accessible and they're not getting that polished behind the scenes kind of space, the more easy it is to say, well, this person is not a god, and therefore we have to deal with that and decide whether or not it's acceptable to watch their work. Um, and what I do think is the only difference about TV and about film is that, like you said, there are so many people that have to get involved in it, and that's why
Right.
sometimes TV and film is so magical and why it takes such a big grasp. And I don't think I have an answer to whether or not it's you can separate the two in this situation, but I do think the one thing that has stuck with me a lot was what Sarah Michelle Gellar posted after the Charisma Carpenter stuff came out, which was
I
very
will always
simple.
be, proud
Yeah.
to be associated with Buffy,
Yes.
but I don't wanna be associated with the name Joss Whedon, or I'm paraphrasing a
Yeah,
little bit, yeah.
exactly. Paraphrasing, but essentially just I don't have to be I don't want anyone to associate with me with Joss. I will always be proud to be Buffy Summers.
Right.
Um, and I think sometimes that's kind of where I land, where it is like, yeah, I know this happened. And it's not always. I think it's case by case. There's different things, especially when you start to say like, oh, here's that thing that you wrote, and now I can see how it connects to this bad view that you have that I don't agree with.
Mhm. Yeah.
And there's those instances, but I do think that element of this show that means so much to people, to so many people, to this work that means so much, you can't necessarily take away the steps that are relevant to you.
Yeah.
And that Buffy can still be Buffy without Joss, kind of, as much as
Right.
close as you can get to it. Like, as I'm saying it, I'm like, I don't know. But yeah.
No, and I mean, and it is interesting because there's a part of it that is like, you know, until 2016, I could not talk enough about how much I loved Joss Whedon and how much I like wanted to emulate Joss Whedon and to write like Joss Whedon and to have shows like Joss Whedon. Um, and in these past couple of years, there's now kind of an interesting knee-jerk reaction to kind of be like, maybe I just don't talk about that anymore. Like even when you approached me about the show, like I think we talked about this a little over text message, where it was like, you know, you told me what the premise of the show was, and we were both kind of like, okay, yeah, we know what we're talking about. But there was kind of a moment of kind of like, should I just talk about Farscape instead? Like, Lord knows that that's just kind of like a simpler, cleaner, I can just talk about how much I love this space show that the Jim Henson Company made, and that I think is one of the most like criminally underseen things ever. Everybody go watch Farscape. Um, and it just kind of stops there. It's just kind of like, I saw this show and I liked it and it was wonderful and I think about it a lot to this day and I steal about it a ton. I steal from it a ton in my writing to this day, even when I'm not writing about space things. Um, but it's kind of like, if we're talking about like fandom impacting my life, like this is
Mhm.
the one. This is the
Yeah.
one that kind of, again, like, and it is talking about like those dominoes that got knocked over. It sort of like not only defined a lot about how I relate to media and the kind of media that I like and the kind of media that I consume. Um, but it then led me to go to university in a specific place and to seek out a specific kind of education that then led me to a set of collaborators that are still the ones that I work with to this day. It is kind of, the most impactful piece of media that my life has had. And it's now a little bit of kind of this like, do I talk about it? Do I articulate these things? Because there is a little bit of a poisoned apple quality to it, given just like how wrong the Whedon train got derailed by all of this systematic abuse that this man, doled out over the years.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's hard about it, right, is that there's arguably a ton of media that wouldn't exist if Buffy hadn't happened.
Yes. Yes,
And I think,
absolutely.
like, that's the hard part is it's I if I yeah, I usually end this show with a question of, if you had never seen this piece of media, what would be different? But I think another which we've
Everything
sort of
except my name. You know, I would
Just
still
be
have that, but very little else.
But I think the other interesting question about this one in particular that's hard to look at with everything that's happened since is what would be different about media without
Mhm.
Buffy the
Oh,
Vampire
yeah.
Slayer? You know, there's
Absolutely.
it is I mean, arguably, the entirety of the CW doesn't exist,
The
you
entirety of
know?
the CW does not exist, at least not without looking radically different.
Right.
I think that a lot of the quote unquote golden age of television kind of doesn't happen, at least in the way that it did, because that was kind of propelling forward a model of auteur storytelling that
Mhm.
I think Joss Whedon, along with like Chris Carter and a couple of other people in the 90s, were really kind of driving forward.
Yeah.
I think that without Buffy, you absolutely do not get lost. Least of which was
Absolutely.
because of how many people came out of Buffy and then went on to make Lost.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, it is kind of this very, very big central monolith that without it, a lot of kind of the landscape of media looks very different.
Yeah. No, and it's crazy because it's these things where it's like, I don't know that there's Twilight without Buffy, despite how much of, how much of the
Maybe.
Buffy
Yeah.
fandom didn't want Twilight there. There is I think there's one interview that I got thrown in my face a lot in high school, which was that, Stephanie Meyer did say that she dreamed about Edward Cullen after falling asleep watching Buffy.
Sure.
So there is that.
And to be fair, I think that without Anne Rice, we don't have Buffy the
Right. Do
Vampire
we don't have
Slayer. So
Buffy?
like everybody
So
keep your shirts on,
yeah,
okay?
everybody keep it
Like,
together.
like come on.
No, I'm not saying no, by no means am I saying Joss Whedon invented the vampire,
No,
or
no, no.
even the hot vampire, to be
No.
fair. But I do think there is this element of does Teen Wolf exist in the same way?
No.
These shows probably
Yeah.
exist, but do they exist in the same way? I don't think so. Um,
No, like there is absolutely kind of the and like it comes back to that the qualities of a show that would have the ostentatiousness to call itself Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
mhm,
Sort of these shows that are intensely not only genre, but genre in this way that is subversive and playful and kind of formal. Yeah, like no, I don't think that we have any of that.
yeah,
I would be extremely curious about in the alternate world where Buffy doesn't happen if we even get like community.
yeah,
Because sort of that like we're just going to like reinvent ourselves every week and do a different little experiment every week. I'm like, I think that there's a straight line between Buffy doing things like we're just going to do an episode that is without any dialogue, or we're going to do an episode that is just for people's dreams for the entire episode. I think that there's a line between that and remedial chaos theory and the paintball
yeah.
episodes of Community and all these things.
Yeah, I come back to it, and I think mostly I've thought about that a lot because of how late I watched Buffy,
Hmm.
which was I didn't watch Buffy until 2020, which felt crazy. And I do remember thinking,
Yeah.
I've missed the boat. It's probably too late. There's no way this is still going to be good.
Oh yeah. And
And
then
it, and then you watch it, and it's
no.
still relevant. Like it
Yeah.
still hits moments that you feel like I haven't. Not only do I feel like I haven't seen this or I haven't felt this or it speaks to me, but you can say, "Oh, I can see how this turned into this, which is this other thing that really affected me." And
No,
so,
it's
actually,
no,
I've
it
been affected by Buffy for years.
right. It's like it's like when you finally watch like My So-Called Life, and all of
Mhm.
a sudden it's like, oh, every single fucking high school show, including Buffy, was just
Right,
pointing back to this thing.
right.
Um, and number one, this thing still fucking kicks. Like,
Yeah.
there's like 3 episodes that have not aged well at all, but the rest
Yep.
of it is
The
still
rest of it
like
pops,
this
you know?
powerhouse of a soap opera.
Yeah.
Um, and it is kind of this like strange combination of, in some ways, it is like, oh, we cut down this tree and we thought that these were all the rings that there were. And now all of a sudden, like, whoa, no, there's this whole other ring back here that is
Yeah.
older and deeper and more ingrained. But at
Yeah.
the same time, it's also like, but it's not like watching some, early silent film that like now only
No,
has kind of
no.
academic application. It is sort of this like, no, this is still powerful and compelling. And this has this like primordial efficacy to it that so
Right.
much of the other things that I've liked up to this point have only been copying or have only been deriving or have only been aping in some unconscious way.
Yeah, and it's not even always like this, like, epic intellectual thing either. Like, I
Mhm.
look at when I was watching it, I was like, "Oh my god, Spike is the blueprint for every
For so
male
many
character
things.
I was
For
so
so many
attracted to in
things.
high school, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just he is the blueprint, and
Yeah.
it's just like, oh, so he invented hotties too. I get it. Like,
Joss Whedon invented sex and then ruined it. You
and then
heard it here
ruined it. You
first.
heard it here.
Yeah.
No, but it is just this crazy thing where I do think it is just this massive piece of media that has
Mhm.
affected so much media afterwards.
Yeah.
And I guess my hopeful take on it is that I hope from people like you who watched it in a very formative piece of their lives and then decided I'm going to make media also,
Mhm.
is that you kind of can correct those same mistakes, right? Is that we can have good content
Right.
creators that come out of this, and we can have really cool TV shows that are desperately trying to emulate that lightning in a bottle moment because that's what they felt and they want to create. And hopefully, despite the negativity of someone existing in that space, it leads to the what we wish it had been, I suppose.
Or like the not umbrage, yeah, the comfort I think is that it's hard to say that all of the things that we so liked about that show had to be the product of a problematic man, you know? Like I joked about Alfred Hitchcock earlier, but there is a certain amount of like, yeah, kind of only someone that was horrible the way that Hitchcock was horrible could make those movies. Like, ugh, like that is like, come on, like, like it's not that surprising that like those movies that make you feel like a creepy voyeur were made by a creepy voyeur, okay? Um with Joss Whedon, it is sort of, because like it's folly to pretend that he did not completely influence me and a lot of other people in my generation of kind of up and coming storytellers, or at least people that hope are up and coming. Maybe I'm sliding downwards as a storyteller. Um, it
I
is
don't
kind
think
of
so.
it is very much sort of a like, like they fuck you up, your mom and dad, and
Yeah.
also Joss Whedon, like, that's there. The impact is there, and we can't do anything about it except carry forward the parts of it that worked and leave behind and make an effort to leave behind the parts of it that hurt people in the making of those shows and kind of go, let us do our level best to reckon with this, to not ignore it, to not simply pretend that this isn't part of the DNA of the thing, but then also unbundle it and uncouple it and kind of carry forward the good parts of it and leave the rest of it behind where it belongs.
I think that is a quite inspiring and hopeful note that I didn't know that we would get to from this
A nice
topic.
surprise, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it may be where we leave it because I think the answer to the classic question that we end here is, who would you be without Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
An incredibly different person. I mean, I don't even know if I would be working in media. I think that I might maybe be a unemployed author,
Mm,
an unpublished author.
unemployed author.
Yeah, not even unpublished,
Just
unemployed,
just
perhaps
unemployed.
unemployable. Yeah, no,
Ooh.
no, no. um,
But I
yeah,
like your idea of, I'd like to end on your wonderful notion of, can we take the good and hopefully make more good out of it and start to leave the bad behind, which I think
and
is
that's where we
lovely.
shall leave it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me and talking about a tough topic. To put it mildly. I made it sound so much more dramatic than it was. Thank
We
you for
had
talking.
fun, and then we didn't, and then hopefully we had fun again.
Yeah, we love fun on this show. Thank you for loving things as deeply as you did. So until next Wednesday, this has been You Are What You Love. I hope you had a good time. We'll be back every Wednesday with new guests and new topics to talk about. But in between, you can find me on Twitter at Marissa Kumari, where you can also find my newsletter that ties into this show. You can also find all of that information at our website, tandonproductions.com, and just click on our show art on the homepage.